And I would like, and I'm delighted to introduce Jonathan Bergwerk, which I should have spent time practicing his German surname, but instead we had a lovely conversation about the audacious Jews in the world. And Jonathan, having graduated in economics, oh yes, had career, been in occupational psychology, helping people and organizations understand each other better. Jonathan has given many presentations on Jewish history, including at Radlett Reform, Jewish Care and Limut, and now at LSE.
Yeah.
They have been published in a series of books called Audacious Jewish Lives, which you actually can find online, as I did a couple of days ago. Each presentation outlines the individual's life, their contribution to society, and their impact on Jewish life. I've heard from my friends in Radlett how wonderful your talks are, so I'm absolutely excited and delighted to welcome you here. Thank you so much for giving up your time and sharing with us the lives of those amazing, famous Jewish people who we know so much about from different sources and not necessarily the actual information, rather myth, and learning about them as real people as well as their history. Thank you very much, Jonathan.
Oh, well, thank you, Tanya. It's a real pleasure being here. I'm looking forward to not just tonight, but the whole course that we've got, because it's tackling 6 different Jews. I'll come to that at the very end of tonight so you can see what we're doing. I guess the idea behind it is, and why I call them audacious Jews, is that they are the lives of influential Jews who kind of battle the tide of conventional thinking. So they're not the standard sorts of people, the ones who stand out, the different sorts of people. So we're going to be looking at their lives, what they believed in, and their contribution to Judaism. And over the course, we're going to be looking at a really wide range of people. So people in finance today, politics, psychology, art, music, science. So covering the entire range of civilization, really. So now this evening, I'm going to be talking about the Rothschilds, as Tanya mentioned, and actually the first few generations. So up to World War I, basically. And especially the founding generations and their views on Zionism. That's also what we'll be talking about. And they're also key to establishing how British Jewry is today. So the reason why most Jews who go to Orthodox synagogues are not Orthodox, in my view, is due to the Rothschilds. I'll try to explain why one shul is more popular than this one when it shouldn't be.
Oh, look forward to that.
Okay, so I think it's probably useful to look at some background before I start. So we're talking about 19th century Europe, which was a really challenging and interesting time to be Jewish in many ways. There was the struggle for emancipation going on. There was different levels of discrimination in different countries. So it was good in Britain, probably because we didn't have a king that mattered very much, or they were just they weren't autocracies here. It was more like a democracy. We've gone backwards since then, but anyway, at that point we were better. It was bad to be a Jew in Austria and Germany. There were lots of wars going on: the Napoleonic War, clearly, the 1848 revolutions, all sorts of political turmoil. It was difficult being anything, let alone Jewish. There was the Industrial Revolution, so the way that people were operating was changing. Banks were starting. It was a real time of real turmoil, really. Lots of volatility. Should Jews keep their heads down, or should they make themselves known? Okay, so the way I'd like to do this is I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to take you through a series of slides. Feel free to interrupt or put comments in the chat box if it's not clear, and I will endeavour to answer them. That's it. Okay, so these are the founding generation of the Rothschild family. So we have the father down at the bottom, Mayer Amschel, and his 5 sons. And I will be talking all about them. So Mayer Amschel is the big father behind all these. All these sons were born in a ghetto. They had this restless drive to achieve. And through this successful risk-taking which they did, they established themselves in 5 different centres across Europe. So Nathan was in London, James in Paris, Amschel in Frankfurt, Karl in Vienna, and Solomon in, Karl in Naples and Solomon in Vienna. And in the mid-19th century, the family possessed the largest private fortune in the world. So the song, If I Were a Rich Man, from Fiddler on the Roof, was originally written in Yiddish as Wenn ich bin Rothschild, so if I were a Rothschild, and it's got adapted. So their name is synonymous with wealth and self-indulgence and influence. And their rise was incredibly rapid. Nathan and James were the 2 richest men in the world, having started from nothing. So this was seen as a real inspiration to many immigrants. Anti-Semites, on the other hand, regard the family as evidence of a sinister international Jewish conspiracy. They suffered political abuse, and it's still going on today. The name Rothschild still conjures up this. By the end of the century, they saw themselves as socially elite, sort of akin to royalty, really. And they frequently married cousins of different branches of their family. They did use their wealth to achieve Jewish civic equality throughout Europe and also social respectability for themselves. And influential in building UK Jewry in mimicking their own values. And that still exists today, particularly in the United Synagogue. So they peaked in the late 19th century, and since then the family has taken a pretty low-key public profile, focusing on their wealth, their estates, their art, philanthropy, wine, clearly, and science as well as financial services. Okay, so let's start off with the patriarch, Mayer Amschel Rothschild. This is a misnomer, by the way. He was called Mayer. It really should be Mayer Ben Amschel, because, you know, obviously it's a Hebrew name, but they got rid of all that. Actually, the first member of the family to use the name Rothschild was Isaac zum Rothschild, who died in 1590. He was called Rothschild because there was a red shield on the door of his house, and that's why they got their name. All the Jews got surnames in odd ways. And we don't know anything much about the rest of the next few generations. What we do know is that they lived in Frankfurt. Mayer Amschel was born in 1744 in the Judengasse, which is the ghetto in Frankfurt. And this is a picture of both the street and it's the curled one that you can see in the map. It's the only street in the ghetto. It's 12 feet wide. His family was into second-hand clothing, as you would expect a nice Jewish family. He went to yeshiva at Fürth, but stopped his studies aged 12 when his parents died in an epidemic. He moved to Hanover, became an apprentice, and learnt about commerce from a business associate of his father. And then returned to Frankfurt in 1764 and started trading in antiques, especially coins, which he sold to this guy, William IX of Hesse-Kassel. It's a great name, Hesse-Kassel. So he he's going to become the king. So basically, Rothschild's a court agent by 1769. And he made a fortune, this guy here, William IX, by conscripting his army and selling them as mercenaries to the highest bidder. And Britain was the highest bidder. So his troops fought in the American War of Independence. And he earned a lot from that, which he spent with the Rothschilds. Rothschild married this lady, who looks very impressive, doesn't she? Güttler, Now, she looks impressive. The reason she looks impressive is that, so he was 26, she was 16 when they married. She lived the rest of her remaining 80 years in the ghetto, regardless of the wealth that she achieved, or that her kids achieved. She had 19 children in 20 years. Yeah, so there's a challenge for you all. 10 survived, 5 boys and 5 girls. This is the surviving lot of them. I just put them down here. The ones with Mayer against them, they follow this tradition of the, yeah, that's right, the son of thing. These are the 5 key ones, so Amschel, Solomon, Nathan, and so forth. And I've put for those ones where they actually founded their banks and when, and also the male heirs. The reason for that is that the males were so crucial in the family. They treated the females very differently, never gave them any responsibility. The females have a really interesting story, which perhaps another time I could talk about, but not tonight. So, Rothschild's business, oh, I should point out a couple of things. You can see that Nathan founded the bank in England very early. This is at 1797. And that's going to dominate. And obviously, they're on the different sides of the war against Napoleon at this time. So Jacob founded the bank in Paris quite late, 1812. These are going to become the 2 big ones. So the father's business prospered, and he moved to one of the best houses in the Judengasse. This is this one here, 1783. He moved there. It's still only 14 feet wide. And it's got 3 stories though. All the sons shared 1 bedroom in this house. He started his banking business in the 1790s with William's treasurer as a silent partner. And this took off spectacularly in the Napoleonic Wars. So by 1797, he had an international business. He was one of the richest Jews in Frankfurt. He basically is exploiting his contacts at court and undercutting his competitors. He didn't make much profit to start off with, just grew it, really like Google or Amazon have done in recent times. In fact, there's a lot of similarity, I think, between the Rothschilds and some of these social media companies. He became court agent to a number of kings, including this guy, Francis II of Austria. And in fact, in 1800, he secured a contract to provide the Austrian army with grain and cash. The Austrians are obviously opposed to the French in the Napoleonic Wars, but he kind of operated on both sides and sold to them both. As the French advanced in 1806, William the King fled, so Mayer looked after his money and managed his investments. The Rothschild sons, they were all employed by the patriarch, and he basically treated them as subordinates. They weren't really partners. He decided who they could marry, but he transformed the business to Mayer Amschel, Rothschilds and Sons in 1810. And the sons moved from assistants to, in theory, partners. But the founder's primacy was up there. And you can see, this is the agreement when they formed it, and this is the quote about him, the patriarch. Through the industry which he evinced from his youth onwards, his commercial abilities and the indefatigable activity which he has maintained into his old age has laid the basis for the prosperity of the firm and thereby established the worldly fortune of his children. Obviously, he's writing this and making them sign it and saying, you know who you owe to. So I think it says a lot about him, really.
Yeah.
Now, the agreement stated that when a partner died, the widow and heirs would be denied access to the firm's books. Wives could not look at what was going on. In fact, Rothschild women, that means both wives and daughters, as well as the son-in-laws, were explicitly excluded from the business. And this was going to carry on for 100 years, this approach to it. What was he like religiously? He was traditional. He was orthodox, as it was defined then. But he was liberal in supporting secular education, and he definitely wanted to get full civil and political rights for Jews. So in 1811, he paid 440,000 gulden, which is a huge amount, to obtain citizenship rights for Frankfurt's Jews. Basically, he bought Jewish freedom. This is the first time that had been done. And also, I mean, he was a real mensch, you could argue. He, as you know, there's a law or a custom within Judaism that you give 10% of your profits to charity as an organization. He gave 10% of his running costs to charity. So this is a huge amount, really. He died in 1812, age 69, but remained an immensely influential role model for his sons. And much of their success was due to them following in his footsteps. So they often quoted his aphorisms. I've got 3 here for you. If you can't make yourself loved, make yourself feared. And you have to be ready to try everything to get in with such a great government figure. And then if a high-placed person enters into a financial partnership with a Jew, he belonged to the Jew. So I think that gives an indication that they were ruthless in business, effectively. So that's the founding father. Now, the first branch to be founded was the English branch, which was founded by Nathan, who was fiercely ambitious. He was belligerent and calculating. He left Germany in 1797, and he started in Manchester, actually, started a business exporting cotton goods. The Jewish community was very small there at the time, but there were no restrictions on where a Jew could live, unlike in Germany. So there's no ghettos or anything like that in Britain, obviously. He had really strong business acumen and quickly made enormous profits, selling in the war, clearly, for uniforms and so forth. And there was an embargo on Europe, but he ignored those trade restrictions, and he sold extensively. So there was France had imposed a blockade, and he just carried on the business illegally by smuggling goods, effectively. Or you could argue he was fighting for the British cause, whichever one you want to call it. In 1806, he married Hannah. Now, Hannah is the daughter of Levi Barent Cohen, who's a big macher in the community. Not macher, because it'd be Sephardi, but anyway, whenever the...
Macher is the word, yeah.
In the Sephardi word for macher, I don't know what that is, but he was a leading London merchant. But Cohen's got a really interesting place. Another of his daughters is Judith, who is going to marry Moses Montefiore, who you might have heard of. He becomes probably the most important British Jew in the 19th century. Moses goes into business with Rothschild, doing quite a bit of his dirty work for him, makes millions and retires very early on. In 1806, do you remember I told you that William's investments, William in Germany had disappeared, left the investments with the Rothschilds. The Rothschilds shipped all this money, £600,000, across to Britain, and they use it to buy British securities. They're using the king's collateral to amass a real fortune, both for the king and themselves. He becomes a leading light on the London Stock Exchange. It's got his own position there. You can see this is the right-hand one is a cartoon from Punch, and this was called Rothschild's Pillar. His share dealings were closely followed by competitors because he had so much money. So if he was to buy, then other people would want to buy. So what he did, he used to use multiple people to run errands for him and do his buying, and he would buy and sell at the same time to confuse people what was going on. They're really streets ahead of everyone else. And he formally established the bank of N.M. Rothschilds, which still exists, in St. Swithin's Lane in 1811. Between 1813 and 1815, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, this was the decisive business coup of his career. He almost single-handedly by now was financing the British war effort. He was providing huge loans to cover the Duke of Wellington's army in Spain, and he was smuggling the money to pay for it across Europe. In 1815, he transported $10 million alone, worth billions in today's money, on horses and carriages, and he earned a 2% commission, which is huge, but he took all the risks. He had to keep the operation entirely secret. Obviously, his brother in France really helped the situation. So this is a quote about him, and you can see he's cut off the old block. He's just like his father. "I care not what puppet is placed upon the throne of England to rule the empire on which the sun never sets. The man who controls Britain's money supply controls the British Empire, and I control the British money supply." So you can see what he thinks of himself. And being a bit cynical, they were absolutely at the centre of things and really important. And this is from a standing start. They were from a ghetto. It's astonishing, really. So he organised the transfer of millions to Britain's allies. No other firm was willing to guarantee delivery of cash to remote places such as Warsaw in Poland. A bit like getting money to Kiev today, I don't know. The Rothschilds secured a more favourable exchange rate by leading the market effectively. So they were making huge profits because they were always ahead of the market because they controlled so much money. And Nathan, he controlled all the other brothers. They called him the commanding general, and he dominated the partnership after the father died in 1812. His only interests were business. He told his brothers what to do and where to live. And he had a huge appetite for risk, was intolerant of inept subordinates. They also developed a fantastic communication system which enabled him to learn about the victory at Waterloo 48 hours ahead of the government did, the head of the British government. So they invested hugely in government bonds, and they made profits of more than $250,000 in the upswing. The Rothschilds transmitted the entire indemnity after 1815. That's £120 million. These numbers are just so vast, it's just difficult to get your head around it, really. By 1818, they had created the international bond market. So that is where you can buy bonds. You can basically, Prussia could sell its debt in London or any other country. And so they created this market because they agreed to act as the lender of last resort, effectively. In 1825, there was a stock market crash, and he backed up the Bank of England. The Bank of England didn't have enough cash to support the market. So this is similar to 10 years ago, 2008, the Bank of England had to step in and provide it. They didn't have the money to do it because we were on the gold standard. So Nathan was the one who basically stopped the country going bankrupt, or certainly the Bank of England. 73 British banks did go bust in that time. So it's become effectively as powerful as a country, which is like Google or Facebook is today. And this is going to influence very strongly, by the way, next time's topic when we talk about Karl Marx, because they complement each other very well, because they clearly were having huge power at this point, and that could be either for good or for bad.
So the QAnon were right, or are right?
No, because there was no big agenda. I'll come to that. But they were actually quite straight about why they were doing it. They were just wanting to amass money, but they're not using that for anything else, I don't think. So, hugely wealthy. His hospitality was accepted by the Brits, but he wasn't really liked. He didn't respect social rank. He came across as poorly educated, intimidating, and vulgar. He clearly was new money, not old money. So he and his brothers didn't really fit into high society. He actually turned down a knighthood because he thought it was a waste of time. When he died, his wealth was £3.5 million, which was the richest man in the world, having started from nothing. He died actually quite young, and his eldest son, Lionel, who's a picture here, he succeeded him as head of the London branch when Nathan died in 1836. Now, Lionel, you might have come across him, he was the one who was elected MP for the City of London in 1847, but he couldn't take his seat because the swearing-in oath required him to say, "on the true faith of a Christian." and he refused to do that. So he resigned and was re-elected 3 times. This was like a cycle. And he only did this in order to break this system. So he wanted Jews to be accepted. There were a few areas where Jews weren't allowed in, like some Oxbridge colleges and so forth. And the Rothschilds were very keen to ensure civic equality. So after 3 times, it was another Jew, Benjamin Disraeli. He engineered a change in the wording of the oath, and he finally took his seat in 1858. And he was MP for 10 years, and throughout that entire time, he never made a single speech. His brother also became an MP, and his son was elected for Aylesbury. So a Rothschild held this seat for over 70 years. It kind of became traditional that they held the seat. And why in that area, why Aylesbury? Because the 3rd generation acquired many houses in Buckinghamshire. This is him being introduced. So Champneys, was now a health farm, you might have heard of. They also built Halton House, which is now an RAF centre, and Wadston Manor, which you can get married at, and which is part of National Trust, is it, or English Heritage, somewhere like that. They built these to lavishly entertain ministers and important clients. I just think it's amazing to think that the parents of the people that bought this, they started off in a ghetto, living 5 to a room. It's just incredible. In 1847, Anthony, who is the 2nd son of Nathan, he was made a hereditary baronet of the United Kingdom. So he's the 1st baronet, and then Natty, who's the son of Lionel, he was granted the hereditary peerage, Baron Rothschild. And you can see, so this is the first Jewish peer, Natty, and you can see he looks British. The bank is still growing at this point. They made many government loans, including they paid for the emancipation of the slaves, or loaned money for the emancipation of slaves, for the relief of the Irish famine. They paid £30 million for the Crimean War, and also, famously, £4 million to buy the shares in the Suez Canal. So the Bank of England, again, couldn't raise the money, and Disraeli called his mate, and they got the money the next day. Between 1865 and 1914, they raised over £1 billion in foreign securities and £1.5 billion in foreign government bonds. That's 75% of the world total. So you can see how they are dominating. They also funded this guy, Cecil Rhodes, who was in Rhodesia, the British South African company. And in fact, the Rothschilds helped set up the Rhodes Scholarships at Oxford. Rothschilds were also largest shareholders in Rio Tinto, in De Beers, so heavily involved in South Africa. Natty headed the English company for 40 years. He was Lord Lieutenant of Buckinghamshire, a governor of the Bank of England, an active right-wing Tory. And the 3 English sons and Ferdy, who's their Austrian cousin, were intimate friends of the Prince of Wales. That's who's going to become king, clearly, Edward VII. So that's the oldest son of Victoria. So they really made it as English country gentlemen. And they were devoted to their entertaining and their hunting and their horse racing and art collecting. So this generation was really much less business inclined than previous ones. And their complacency meant that the bank declined after 1880. As late as 1915, it was still not using double entry bookkeeping, and there was only 1 typewriter in the entire office. So these are the 2, Alfred and Laura, running at this point. Alfred was of the view that a gentleman is not to be found in the office before 11 and never stays after 4. So you can see hugely different to the generations above, absolutely. Exactly. The bank failed to establish a branch in New York, which was a big mistake. And then they really suffered in World War I because Natty died in 1915, Leo in 1907, and Alfred in 1918. And each time they had to pay huge death duties. So the bank rapidly declined after them. So that's the English branch. The French branch was set up by James. It was called the Rothschild Frères, set up in 1812. James set it up when he was 20. And he was the youngest son by far, but much less submissive than to Nathan than his older brothers. He married his niece from Vienna, Betty, and she was a fantastic hostess. And they actually built the most lavish of all the Rothschild mansions at Ferrières. From the 1930s, he played a major role in underwriting bonds that built the railways and mining, and he ran the leading bank in France for 20 years. He was banker. You may not know French politics. These two guys are opposites. You've got the Bourbon Charles X, and you've got the Orleans Louis Philippe, and they would never talk, but they both banked with the Rothschilds. There was a revolution in 1848. He survived that, and he loaned to the kings as well, so Napoleon III and Leopold I of Belgium. So he really had a crucial place in European politics for over 40 years. The capital of the bank expanded rapidly. They did face serious opposition, some of it motivated by anti-Semitism, especially after a railway accident in 1846 in a company that they had financed. And a hostile journalist called George Darnvelli wrote, "The Rothschilds have only ever gained from our disasters. When France has won, the Rothschilds have lost. This house, the House of Rothschild, is our evil genius." France is becoming more and more anti-Semitic in the 19th century, much more so than anywhere else in Europe, probably. What else you might know in France is obviously the wine. Actually, the first estate, Chateau Brun-Mouton, was bought by Natty, that's Nathan's third son, the British bit. But James bought the Chateau Lafite, which was next door, in 1868. And that's when he died. His funeral was a huge affair, attended by thousands, as well as all three chief rabbis of the community. And when he died, he was one of the richest men in history, worth about £10 million. This is about 1% of the entire national product of France, so huge. He was succeeded by his eldest son, Alphonse, who led the indemnity negotiations after the 1871 defeat. So again, an important banker. In fact, he transferred 10% of national product smoothly without causing inflation, which is astonishing. Again, death due to the family declined. They did all escape from France in 1940, so all that wing of the family escaped, but the company subsided. The Vienna branch was established by Salomon. That was originally a subsidiary of the Frankfurt house. And in Austria, as I mentioned, there was a lot of anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish discrimination, really. But he still did build the first railroad in Austria. And also he established the Kreditanstalt, which is effectively Austria's central bank. He again, like his brothers, entertained lavishly. He became the richest man in Austria, of course. And it was in 1843 the first Jew to be granted Austrian citizenship. He got into severe financial trouble in 48 and had to be rescued by his brothers. Politics in Europe, the decline of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, its defeat in Italy in 1859 meant that the whole country declined and therefore the bank with it. And it was dismembered after 1918. They did shore up this bank here, the Kreditanstalt, after the 1929 crash, but it had to be surrendered to the Nazis after Baron Louis Nathaniel de Rothschild, was arrested 2 days after the Anschluss in 1938, and he was held hostage for a year until international pressure and the largest ransom payment ever allowed the family to flee. $21 million they had to pay in order to get him at that time. Frankfurt branch was headed up by Amschel after Mayer died, and he was the most powerful banker in Germany. He made loans to lots of German rulers. He was very different to the brothers, though. He was risk averse. He was a traditional Jew as well, and in 1843 he signed a contract to build a synagogue, the first time Jews had acquired land outside the Frankfurt ghetto. He didn't have any sons, so he was succeeded by his religiously observant nephews from Naples. And Mayor Karl, the guy on the left, he was elected for Frankfurt for Parliament, to the Parliament of the new North German Confederation. He dished out a bit of money to get the elected, and he won 5,300 votes out of 5,600. So he clearly was effective in his use of money. These two brothers had 10 daughters between them, but no sons. So the Frankfurt house closed after that. That was just their rules of it. And the final branch is the Naples branch, which was founded in 1821 by Karl, a subsidiary of the Frankfurt house. It became the financial mainstay of the Bourbon monarchy. The Pope was also a client. He was insecure and afraid of Nathan. So he was succeeded by his son. But when Italy unified, the Naples Bank closed. That's 1861. So why were they so successful? So the father's biggest legacy was to maintain their fraternal unity. On his deathbed, he said this: "Amschel, keep your brothers together and you will become the richest people in Germany." And that is indeed what they managed to do. And I think it's quite an interesting contrast to our Jewish history, if you like. If you look at Genesis, it's the story of brothers not working together. And led to real problems. And when Judaism doesn't, Jews don't work together, it divides, but these guys clearly did. Until the 1860s, the five houses worked closely together, effectively a part of one large multinational bank. And this mutual trust and dependency was the greatest cause of their success. The partnership gradually moved apart and it was broken up in 1905. They were secretive to the outside world. They had two sets of accounts. So the source of much of their wealth still is a secret or a mystery. But they were easily the biggest bank in the world for 100 years after 1815 until World War I. Before 1824, they tended to marry members of other similar wealthy Jewish families. But as they became more successful, outsiders were just not good enough. So after 1824, they often married other Rothschilds. So these five sons of the founder, they had 12 sons between them, 9 of whom married other Rothschild women. 15 out of 21 marriages between 1824 and 1877 were between Rothschilds. And that's a higher rate of intermarriage than even the royal family. And it basically were designed to stop outsiders getting a share of the fortune. They were very adept at establishing personal relationships with those in power. And at the time, it was the norm for politicians to accept financial favors from bankers. And the Rothschilds were extremely adept at doing this, at bribing, giving generous presents, cheap loans. They made money lending to governments, getting news quicker than their competitors, and by speculating in bonds. So they effectively did create the capitalist class who invested in bonds rather than in land. They also established a network of communication based on couriers and also carrier pigeons across Europe, which until the arrival of the telegraph in 1848 meant that they heard news quicker than others. And they communicated with each other incessantly. They used Hebrew characters, but a German code, so kind of the reverse of Yiddish. And it was their own language, which is, again, isn't completely clear how to interpret it even to this day. So what about their Judaism? Well, Amschel was, the oldest son, was Orthodox. He built a synagogue in his house, and he financially backed this guy, Samson Raphael Hirsch. I don't know if you've heard of him. He is an ultra-Orthodox, a very anti-reform in Germany. Reform is just starting in Germany at this point, and he is vehemently against it. So Amschel backs him. Both he and Solomon don't work on Shabbat, and they only eat kosher food. Nathan, Carl, James, they are all going to work on Shabbat, but they keep it hidden from their elder brother. And they gradually abandon eating kosher. But unlike many other Jewish families, they refuse to convert. They wouldn't abandon their Judaism just to accept civic equality, so they kept with their Jewishness. And they insisted that Rothschilds marry other Jews, and that the wealth is used to support the position of Jews. And so in 1839, when Nathan's second daughter, Hannah, she renounced her Judaism and married a Christian, this guy, Henry Fitzroy. Both families disapproved, and the Rothschilds ostracized her. She actually ended up having a really tragic life and died alone. 40 years later, Hannah, the only child of Mayer, Nathan's second son. Now, she married the Earl of Rosebery, Archibald Primrose. He's going to be the Prime Minister of Britain. And at this point, she's the richest woman in England. The Rothschilds are still refusing to attend the wedding, and it's Disraeli that actually gives her away at this point. So they're really strict about this. And their Jewishness clearly became the focus of attacks. So the Hep riots were in 1819 in Frankfurt, and they were specifically targeted at the Rothschilds. Amschel receives regular death threats. Their wealth was a subject of lots of envy and suspicion. Some of the hostility they received was due to economic rivalry or jealousy, or perhaps because the Rothschilds identified with conservative regimes, and so were the targets of criticism from Marx and others. So they were also criticized for the extent of the political power they held and for their foreignness, and essentially their lack of tact. I've shown you some of the quotes which I put out there. They weren't at this point playing the game, really. Also, many people couldn't believe that their wealth had been achieved just through trading. How could Jews, who obviously are simple and not educated and not as bright as Christians, how could they have beaten the financial elites? Just didn't make sense. So they were seen as a threat to the established order. And that gave rise to a host of Jewish capitalist conspiracy theories, which still exist today, obviously. And these diatribes and hateful caricatures peaked in France, actually, in the 1880s. I've got a couple of posters from this time. The Rothschilds were seen as disloyal, pro-German, and having too much power. They were accused of dominating world banking and manipulating it for their own financial ends, including provoking wars. So they were accused of starting wars. On the other hand, at times, in 1914, there's a famous leader in which they accused the Rothschilds of being the peace party and refusing to fund reasonable military needs of nation states. So they can't win, basically. The Nazis made the film The Rothschilds, which portrayed them as profiting hugely from the Napoleonic Wars, and the film ends with a burning Star of David over a war, a map of Europe. And obviously it's still used today as a term of insult against the Jews. This is a modern thing from the internet, just so you can see that all these enemies suckling from the Rothschild finances, and the pig obviously being an anti-Jewish metaphor. So anti-Semitism was a huge part of their life, but regardless of that, they also saw community leadership as what they should be doing. So for them, this is how they expressed their Judaism. It meant really, Judaism then meant organizing the Jewish community. It didn't mean halakha and keeping mitzvot. So when they attended synagogue, it was for social, not spiritual reasons. They focused their efforts on giving practical material assistance, and particularly the Rothschild women were really active in health and education and housing charities. They worked tirelessly to pursue Jewish emancipation in communities across the world, in Romania and Russia. They used their money to threaten to pull their business completely out of Frankfurt unless conditions for the Jews improved. And unlike many other leading Jews, they were heavily involved in that campaign to secure the release of the Damascus prisoners in 1840 and financed Montefiore's rescue mission there. They regarded it as self-evident that they should be lay leaders of the community. So for nearly 75 years after 1868, a Rothschild was always treasurer of the Board of Deputies. Nathan was the warden of this synagogue, the great synagogue in Duke Street. This was destroyed in World War II by bombing. It was just north of Aldgate, and it was kind of like the Ashkenazi synagogue of the time. Like Bevis Marks, the Sephardi one. Nathan was also president of the Jews Hospital and other charities. He founded the Jews Free School, which was originally in Spitalfields before moving, and other Rothschilds supported it as well. His brother Anthony was the first president of the United Synagogue when it was established in 1870. And they held the presidency until 1942. So again, they just dominated it. They were all non-observant. So they still had this presidency despite not keeping anything at this point. They basically wanted to keep out of religion. They did actually intervene with West London at an interesting time. There was in the 1850s, there was an attempt to not allow the West London synagogue onto the Board of Deputies. The chief rabbi at the time didn't want them. And they spoke up against that, but that's the only intervention they really made. They were active, really, in trying to accelerate they called it the Anglicization. It's really the assimilation of newly arrived immigrants from Eastern Europe. They kind of feared that immigrants' foreignness would foster anti-Semitism in England. And that's why they opposed Zionism. They thought that it would prejudice the rights of Jews to settle in England and was a threat to the status of Jews already here. So they rejected Herzl's plea for funds, and then Herzl called them a national misfortune for the Jews. So most of the family were completely indifferent to Zionism, apart from one member of the French family. This is Edmund. He's James's youngest son. Now, he was a leading philanthropist, and he was a really strong advocate of creating a safe refuge for Jews in Palestine. And in fact, he was the first patron. He was a patron of the first settlement, which was Rishon LeZion. He also founded Rosh Pina and Zikron Yaakov. Zikron Yaakov means
memory of Jacob.
Jacob, and the Jacob being
Forefather.
Not his father. It's actually his father that he's remembering, not as in the patriarch. Yeah, so it's actually keeping it in the family. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah. So he bankrolled also, he created the wine industry in Israel now, lots of industry, lots of mining. So Rothschild Boulevard, which I'm sure many of you have walked down in Tel Aviv, this is the Rothschild it's named after. And in 1929, he became the first honorary president of the Jewish Agency. Edmund's son, James, he's the guy that financed the building of the Knesset. And his widow financed the Supreme Court building in Israel. Now, in 1917, we've got a British Rothschild who happens to be this guy, Walter Rothschild. A picture of him there. Do you know the story of the zebras? This is a picture taken at, anyone know where it is? Come across this? This is at Tring. He had a farm out there, excuse me, in which he kept all sorts of animals, including zebras, which he used to pull his cart. And he also happened to be a friend of Chaim Weizmann, vice president of the Board of Deputies, and he was the person who Balfour wrote a letter to in 1917, which is called the Balfour Declaration, which gave the mandate to Israel, and that's where it says, "Dear Lord Rothschild," that's the Lord Rothschild. And he threw a big party in Covent Garden. He called it the greatest event that has occurred in Jewish history for the last 1800 years. So, try to sum up their approach to business. What is it all about? First of all, it's trust the family. Be suspicious of outsiders. They also were driven by a real insecurity. They had a ferocious drive to succeed, to get out of the ghetto, to establish themselves, not be outsiders. The immigrant urge to achieve. And they weren't bad at schmoozing, particularly those who had power. They also took risks. They were opportunistic, they were innovative, they were international, and at the same time, they were pretty ruthless, really. They were clearly knew what they wanted to achieve. They would drive it through. We might see them as arrogant today. They didn't always keep to the spirit of the law, let alone the letter of the law. And I guess that was all summed up maybe in their family motto, which is this: unity, integrity, industry, which is maybe a metaphor for the Jewish people as a whole, or when it's working at its best. So that is the Rothschilds. I don't know whether anyone's got any questions or any comments or any stories. Is anything online, any in the Zoom room that people would like to say?
Talking about the Rothschild family, and the next session is going to be so very different.